Oh, wait. Let me get rid of you and then I'll introduce you, even though we're already live, but it's too late. All right. Hey, guys. Normally I introduce. It's not an official live, as in it's like number 170 of all my lives. But today we have Kamran, and I spelt it incorrectly, even though technically it's correct for whatever language it is that you're watching this in. But today my subject is Kamran Shamsabad, correct?
You got it right.
Thank you. And Kamran Shamsabad is an Australian lawyer. What do you work for a specific law firm, or is it sort of independent?
No, I'm working for a company at the moment called Legal Bit, and I've only got one person that I work with, my partner Mani Shishineh, who's another Iranian.
A fellow Persian.
Fellow Persian, but he's more Iranian than I am. So the funny last name, and obviously the correct but incorrect spelling of my first name on this occasion is because my background is I'm half Persian, specifically Azerbaijani Persian.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the history there.
Well, that's cool. I love that. I love that. I love ethnicities and different backgrounds and the stories. I love that kind of thing. And so how did you guys, so for those who don't know, you work, for lack of a better way to phrase it, you work for Rebel Media.
Yeah, well, I would say I work with, because we are obviously separate. We're not in-house lawyers, technically. We are contracted out to by Rebel. Essentially, what they do is they set up the Fight the Fines campaign, and just like in Canada and in other places where they're running it, I think they might do some in the UK, they get other lawyers to basically come on board who are independent, and they basically give them the cases based on their location or whatnot. So in our case, what happened is they had Mani come on board. Mani got in touch with, I think, Avi, and obviously, volunteered his services in the beginning, and that's where it all started. And then I saw Mani on Avi's channel, and then I reached out to Mani and I said, well, I'd like to help you out, not so much because he was working with Avi or anything, but because the work that he was doing was really important. He was fighting these fines, and he was giving people defenses where normally they wouldn't have had any defense. He was providing that sort of legal service to the community. And that's, for me, very, very important, because as a lawyer, access to justice is, the cornerstone of the profession. And the one thing that I saw all of last year was there was very, very few people stepping up to go out there and fight the fines and tackle these big matters. And the public was basically being left in the lurch. This year, it was even more important because, they ramped up the number of fines that they were giving out. They ramped up the criminalization of the public in relation to the public health orders. So I came in at a very, very good time to basically get neck deep in this area of law.
Yeah, for sure you did. And how would you claim, or how would you state that you're different to GMB lawyers or Bangla lawyers? Like, is there a specific difference in the way you're tackling these things? I think you already told me this, but tell the viewers.
Well, I know GMB, they've had a few big matters, but I know that the focus at GMB, from my recollection, was more on the employment side of things. With Samir Banga, who's a good friend of mine, I really love Samir. He's a fantastic lawyer. He's a very good criminal lawyer. He's been doing a lot of the criminal work very similar to us. And we've been doing a little bit of everything. So we'll basically take on the cases that come in. We're not strictly on employment or criminal or any of that sort of stuff. We've even had some administrative matters where we've had to write letters to the government seeking that someone who's in a hotel quarantine basically get some kind of leniency on the basis that they are either ill or they have a family member who's in very severe need of help, and they should be obviously released. Sometimes, we've had success in those regards. Other times we haven't. It's a mixed bag. It's a very difficult time, legally speaking, because everyone's, exploring new territory, which is why whenever you have things like, GMB, or you have Tony Nikolic or any of these guys basically tackling these big issues and they don't get up, I always say, well, they're taking on something that's very, very important. They're tackling something that's very novel, and ultimately you just got to take your hat off to them, the fact that they're actually doing something, because there's a very large legal community in this country, and for the vast majority of them, most lawyers haven't stepped up to the plate at all. Most lawyers have not cared. Yeah.
But in terms of the angle that they're taking and the angle that you're taking, yours is constitutional law. Theirs is slightly different. That's remember you said that to me at the meeting. What did you say? Just because I'm not saying it right.
Well, I think that what I'd say is, for example, GMB, they've taken a constitutional angle in some of their Supreme Court litigation. I know Tony Nikolic has taken some constitutional angles as well. My background is I have a master's in administrative law, which is another word for public law, and constitutional law is basically my area that I really love. So what I do is I'm looking at these matters from not so much the perspective of vaccines and the constitutionality of vaccines. What I would have said to you, and I think this is what you're getting at, is I'm looking more at the constitutionality of the restrictions in relation to civil rights. So, for example, protest rights, things like that. Whereas I think some of these other guys, they've really focused on your right to work or your right to move. Whereas for us, it's been much more on the civil rights angle. How much can they restrict the right to protest in our country? And that's actually the subject of one of the Supreme Court matters that we have part filed. We have the other part coming up soon. Essentially in relation to two very high profile plaintiffs. Both of them have been essentially, arrested for protesting in the last 20 months. I've got one client who was arrested twice, Victor Tay. His matter's already filed in the Supreme Court. And essentially what we're arguing is that, first of all, the orders have never actually restricted protest, because nothing has ever been expressly said about protest in the orders or in the act. And a fundamental right such as that cannot be abrogated unless some express language is employed. On the alternative to that, we're arguing essentially that the restrictions that have been put in place, if they are taken to have restricted the right to protest, are disproportionate. And essentially they're unconstitutional in that sense. In our country, we don't have a constitutional system like the US where we have a entrenched First Amendment. That's something that I know the Liberal Democrats have proposed in the next federal election, that they want to add a First Amendment clause to our Constitution. However, in the absence of that clause, it's very hard for me to go to the court and say, they've restricted the right to go and protest. Essentially, it's unconstitutional outright. They've restricted the right to go to a religious building. Therefore, it's unconstitutional outright. The way that the Australian courts manage it is much more on the side of, we have to weigh up the risks and the policy that's being employed with the degree to which the burden is placed upon our freedom, which means that essentially the court, has no firm position at the outset. They're going to look at a whole bunch of factors and determine whether it's proportionate to restrict that freedom of protest. So constitutionally speaking, it's not as firm as a First Amendment right, but at the same time, it's something that needs to be tested. It's something that needs to be explored. And in New South Wales, essentially until very recently, it's been almost impossible, if not impossible, to have a protest. In Victoria, just a few weeks ago, obviously, they started protesting again, but the reaction there has been incredibly violent to people protesting. So the question of whether this is constitutional in Victoria or in New South Wales has to be tested, and inevitably
it absolutely is. We all have an implied political right to assemble.
That's right. Implied freedom of political communication is what they call it. Okay. And that includes some element of assembly as well. It includes verbal as well as non-verbal acts of protest. It includes a whole bunch of activities, essentially. And the idea is that if we challenge it in New South Wales, there's already some people challenging it down in Victoria. Essentially what will happen is one of these cases will get appealed to the High Court. And, if we win, we're expecting that we'll get appealed by the other side. If they win, we're expecting to appeal. And the idea ends up being that appeals are going to fly, and inevitably the High Court will have to make a ruling on this.
Hilarious. So that's what I always tell people. I always say, overwhelm the system. Don't worry if you get arrested, or don't worry if you have to pay a fine, just overwhelm the system. You're doing it, but like with appeals, I never thought of it like that. That's really smart. I like that.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily for that reason. It's more so that the
No, but it's
process has to
the
be done, you know?
theory works. Yeah, for sure, for sure. So do you think we have a way out? Do you think because any judge can be corrupt and be like, nah, they're fine. Nah, he didn't pedophile that little girl. Oh, nah. It doesn't matter that he ran over that man. He's a friend of mine, and he's also a fellow judge. Oh, like, he'll get off. Like, can we trust the system with? Can we trust these people with the system? Because it's definitely broken.
I wouldn't necessarily have anything to say about the judges themselves. What I'd say is that there needs
I
to
just
be,
use it as an example, but
yeah.
I meant prime ministers, I meant politicians, I meant all of that.
Sure.
Sorry, I'll let you answer.
I think there needs to be consideration of the way that the judges are approaching the law. And you see this in the United States at the moment. There's a greater focus in the United States at the moment, not so much on the personality of the judge, but upon the theory of law that they bring to the bench. That's something which is very, very important in this country. It's something that we haven't spoken about publicly, but it's something which behind the scenes politicians do consider. And what I mean by this is you seem to get a lot of judges elevated to the Court of Appeal or to the High Court who tend to favor an approach of, interpreting the law that essentially grants very wide powers to the government, isn't interested in a originalist or a textualist evaluation of things. Essentially, they are prepared, based upon their reading of the law, their philosophical understanding of the law, to give the benefit of the doubt to the government whenever it's necessary. So you won't get judges in Australia, based on our current legal tradition, to turn around and do what they did in the US right now, which is basically to injunct the president of the United States. So in the US right now, we've had Biden's vaccine mandate. One of the federal district court's judges has actually injuncted that mandate in, I think, 3 or 4 states, which is his district. Essentially, what they've done is they've said, we are putting a stop to this. We say it's unconstitutional for you to do this. The Supreme Court has to determine the matter. And there's a very good chance the Supreme Court could turn around and say, President Biden's mandate is completely unconstitutional. The whole thing, the whole vaccine mandate. Now, in this country, it is far more difficult, as you've seen with the Kassam rulings in New South Wales or Cotterill and Romanas down in Victoria. It's far more difficult based on the structure of the legal system in our country and also the judicial philosophy applied by the judges to have a judge stand up and say, I'm going to give an injunction against the executive or a declaration against the executive government, basically the premier or the prime minister, to say that their actions are illegal or unconstitutional. You won't get that as much in this country. And you can see that with decisions like the Palmer decision that was published last year. The reality is that the decision-making that's being done in relation to, for example, Clive Palmer's case, which was on the freedom or the right to have interstate intercourse or interstate movement and free trade, absolutely free trade. The court essentially just did away with it. The court said that this isn't to be taken literally, to mean that it has to be absolutely free. That sort of approach to the law leads to the sort of catastrophic outcomes that we have now. When words don't have the meaning that they are meant to have naturally, people cannot rely and people cannot invest themselves as to what the meaning of things are. So like it's very important.
Sorry.
Well, that's one example, but that's
Yeah.
That's something which has been changed.
Start a fight with anyone, okay? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's something which the legislature has changed. In relation to marriage, you could say, well, the federal government had the power to define marriage under the marriage power in Section 51. And it's essentially by exercising the power, it's done that. But in relation to the freedom of interstate movement and trade, the provision says that trade, commerce, and intercourse among the states must be absolutely free. So a state which puts up a border where no one can come in and no trade can move, and that be considered to be constitutional, simply because it isn't protectionistic. It's not trying to benefit domestic industry as opposed to, achieving some legitimate health outcome, let's say. The reality is you're taking these constitutional meanings off into the shed and shooting them. And that's what the High Court has done in some sense, with the recent Palmer decision at least, has taken it out and shot Section 92 straight in the face. This is
about
a problem for us to solve going forward.
what about Victoria and the Premier there? Like that bill, I don't even know if it's passed yet, so I'm a little bit behind, or like, I just don't care, to be honest. I'm just sick of hearing so much corruption in our government. But it was like 19 to 21 initially in the lower house, and all they had to do was say, no, let's make it so that they can't make pandemic laws all the time. But I think we lost. I don't know. Can you
We did in the
update
end,
me?
yes. Yes.
Okay, so all right.
The bill is being passed from last I checked.
Right.
And that's, I'll come out and I'll say it right now. I'm a Liberal Democrat. I'm actually meant to be, I think, a candidate at the next election. Don't ask me where I'm getting the time to do all of these things. The reality of the situation is
I would vote
we
for
had
you.
David
Anyway.
we had David Limbrick standing on the floor of Parliament something like 22 hours, basically, debating this. He's been very, very strong, just like some of the other crossbenchers, in objecting to this new pandemic legislation. Essentially, this is the culmination in Victoria of what civil rights lawyers like myself and other political activists and people that are politically libertarian or philosophically libertarian have been complaining about for the last at least 18 months. There's been a constant drive by the political class to move the country towards a sort of permanent state of pandemic legislation. And that's exactly what we're getting down in Victoria now. And it's something which we are extremely hesitant to embrace, and we shouldn't embrace, because essentially it does the same thing that happened with post 9/11 security laws. You had all of these anti-terrorism laws that were brought in to address the short to medium term problem of terrorism. It's now been more than 20 years and not one has been repealed. They also don't have that much terrorism to police. So what are they being used for now? Well, just generally, they don't have that much terrorism to police. So now those anti-terrorism laws are being used with the data that's being collected, the information that's being collected, being used to chase people based on their taxes, being used to chase people for all sorts of things. So the reality is the purpose that was originally ascribed for a short-term period, we give up these essential rights to privacy, and essentially would be made safe from terrorist attacks. In the end, it's now being used for a whole bunch of other stuff. They're spying on everyone, and at the same time as that, they're remaining permanent. There's no interest in repealing them now. They form part of the core of what government does now. There's whole government bureaucracies dedicated to them. The same thing will happen with this pandemic legislation. They have built systems now over the past 2 years that are here to stay. They have invested billions of dollars in this. There's no way it's going to disappear. It's here to stay. The only way it will move is if people move the political class from where they're sitting back to the caves where they're meant to belong. If people start voting with principle in this country, we will be able to deal with all of these problems. If people continue to vote...
You really believe we can fix the problem with the voters? Because no offense to half of the Australians out there, if not 90% of them, they either donkey vote. I used to donkey vote. They either donkey vote or they don't know what they're voting for, and they're stuck with the tradition. Oh, my dad's Labor, so I'll just vote Labor. Oh, why not Liberal? Like, people don't know what they're doing. And also people seem to think that, for example, you're going to run at the next election, correct?
If my wife gives me the final tick of approval, then yes.
Yes. But okay, say 95% of Australians voted for you specifically. You don't become Prime Minister.
No, that's right. That's right. I would be just a crossbench. It
still goes to the Liberals. Yeah.
Well, potentially. I mean, it all depends. The way the system works is in my electorate, if there's 100,000 people voting and I get the majority of the votes, I get elected. And then if the same thing happens in 20 other seats, we form a very powerful core of MPs essentially.
And that's a great thing. And that's what should happen.
Right. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what I would encourage people. What I would say is don't think it's a zero sum. What I would say to those people who have not voted in the past or have donkey voted in the past is I wouldn't necessarily say that they're dumb. What I would say is that they haven't had a good option in the past. Right now, minor political parties have much more persuasion than ever before. They have much more clout. They've got much more attention, and they are running good quality candidates. And I'm not saying that just because I'm running. There's a lot of very good people from the community standing up that I've met from UAP, from the LDP.
Quality? Yeah.
And they are coming up and they are standing on principle. They're trying to do the best thing for the community. They're not there just because they want to collect a paycheck. They haven't dedicated 40 years of their life to getting elected. These are just ordinary people. I mean, one of them I know from Southwest Sydney is running for the Liverpool area. He's a pastor. He's just a he's a guy who believes in the community and wants to get us back on track. You know, I've got other people around Western Sydney. They're running. They're young. They're energetic. They've never had a political bone in their body before. They've in the last 2 years been invigorated. They've been motivated, and they want to come and they want to actually help the community out of this period. Unlike the politicians, the career politicians who have put us in this hole. And the hole isn't just social or political, it's economic. Okay, you only need to look at the exponential inflation rates that are occurring in the US right now to see that will be where we are heading in Australia. Whenever you won't be able to afford the basics because, you know, there's been a 25% price hike on potatoes, something ridiculous like that. The reality is that the crisis that they have created cannot be avoided. It can only be dealt with and minimized, and you can only do that by political change. So what I tell people, and, you know, I'm running for the LDP most likely, as I say, I'm not trying to sell people that they should vote for the LDP, although I think they should. If they don't want to put LDP number one, that's fine. What I would say is, regardless of your position, put the major parties last on your preference ticket.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I would put Liberal last, then the Greens, and then Labor. Liberal last because they've betrayed us. So
if you're a Labor voter, you're going to be more inclined, because you still hate the Liberals, you're going to be more inclined, if you're still enfranchised in some sense with them, to put, for example, Labor before Liberal, and that's fine. Just make sure that if you're going to do that, second last is Labor, last is Liberal, or vice versa if you're an ex-Liberal.
Liberal has to be that. Look, Liberal is our Conservative Party. Do you know how much they wronged me literally on a personal level? I'm not voting. I'm having nothing to do with the Australian Liberal Party. But yeah, I still think at least Labor and the Greens, as disgusting and evil as they are honest about it. I respect that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Greens, at the very least, they stand on much more principle than Labor or Liberal. I don't agree with a lot of their principles.
Do you know what they used to be called before they called themselves the Greens?
No, I'm pretty sure, wasn't it the Australian Democrats before that? A lot of the Democrats
they were known as the Australian Communist Party. I'm not even joking. That's what the Greens were. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Watermelons is the comment.
Yeah.
Watermelons, green on the outside, red on the inside.
Indeed.
And that's the thing. I don't think that there's anything wrong with the Greens in terms of principle. I think that they stand on more significant principle than the other two parties. I think the Greens are, in principle, environmentalists. They are somewhat authoritarian in how they're going to go about organizing society, probably very authoritarian. I'm being a bit too liberal about it. But at the end of the day, at least you know where they stand. With Labor, with Liberal, you have absolutely no idea where they stand on most of these issues until they come out and the knife is already in their hand and they stab their own constituents in the back. We've seen that with Labor. Absolutely. We've seen that with Labor down in Victoria. Look at the way that the union bosses and the Labor Party called out everyday blue-collar workers who came out against being told they can't go to work unless they comply with a government order. Now the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are facing work shortages. They turn around and they are now proposing to import overseas workers to take those jobs that are now being basically left open because Australian workers can't do it.
My God, they got rid of Ford, and we had car manufacturers here. How much it's like they're saying to us, we don't want you to succeed, but then they're like, please vote for me. F off.
I've said this before. This is why I never wanted to get involved with politics, because I feel like people have already a very, very seriously strong distrust of lawyers, which is, you know, something I've been trying to rectify in my own personal character.
If you were a gardener, you'd get everyone.
Well, that's the thing. You know, if I was a blue collar worker like my parents are, I'm sure it'd be easier and I'm much more relatable for most people. But as a lawyer, obviously, I strove for that, but I still have that ethic, obviously. But I keep telling people, stop electing career politicians, because the career politicians...
I've been saying that for 5 years. Yeah, I agree with you. I've been saying that for ages.
Career politicians are just there, essentially, to get re-elected time and again. They're going to tell you what you want to hear before the election. After the election, they'll only do what their special interest groups are interested in them doing. The ultimate point that ends up being made is you get screwed regardless. Voting for someone who since the age of 14 has wanted to be prime minister is never going to be in your best interest. So the reality is we need that sort of change where people are awake and people are voting for the alternative and giving the major parties a boot up the backside, shifting the political poles around so that we can finally get some principle back into parliament. We can finally get some rational actors driving through the front seat, and we can actually start getting some changes that benefit the public at large, rather than just a few select special interest groups or hysterical middle-aged people who are worried they're going to get a cough. So that's what we need. We need to start making those changes.
Absolutely. Do you think, okay, back to your work with Avi Yamini, Fight the Fines, I've heard murmurings from other people that there is something, and I'm not placing this on you, on Avi, on anyone, I don't know the specifics, but apparently there is something disingenuous about it. I don't know. And I think you and I did speak briefly about this. And essentially it was that sometimes you're given a case that you know has no hope, but that you're sort of expected to somehow still argue it, even though you have an idea that it'll go nowhere. And I've spoken on the phone, I think it was to Serene Tefaha or to someone, and she was, or maybe it was just something that I read that she wrote, and it was basically, this should have never have been put through. You're giving false hope to these people, blah, blah, blah. How do you navigate that when something is given to you and you're like, I don't think I should do this, or do you still do it? How does that work? Do you want to talk about that?
It's a good question generally. In relation to Rebel, I can't really say that, because with Rebel, I get the cases, and the first thing I do before Avi publishes any stories or anything is I have a chat with him if he's bringing the matter to me. He asks me what I think, and the first thing I'll say to him is, this case has good prospects of this, or usually if it's a criminal case, a Fight the Fines case, it's something I can comment on, but in terms of prospects, there might not be as many prospects because the person's already made too many admissions to the police officers or whatever it might be. So the best thing they can hope for is a plea, basically, because there's too much working against us already. And that's happened on a number of cases that the public isn't aware of, because there's such an inundation of Fight the Fines cases. They can't do them all. There just isn't enough.
Of course not.
I'm already overwhelmed, and there's not enough lawyers basically to work on them all. So they are selective about them as well. And for me, I've always had the kind of relationship with Rebel where I'll give them my opinion, and if they instruct me something against my opinion, I don't take those instructions, because they're a third party at the end of the day. I won't take those instructions. I don't have to take those instructions. I wouldn't waste the court's time or anything like that by running arguments that don't have any chance. In relation to whether or not some of them are set up for whatever reason, because they are, good-looking stories, or because, they want to run the argument. I don't know about other lawyers, but for me, the only times on a case, or Manny's taken on a case, is because we think that it actually has the capacity to actually essentially be successful, and also that we can run the case without too much difficulty. And by that, I mean, usually the cases we would prefer to take are cases where we can access them really easily, because we can keep costs low that way. So most of the matters that have occurred in Sydney, you see that we take those on whenever they've got legs, because we can keep the costs low. We don't have to worry about, for example, time or travel or any of that sort of stuff. But there are exceptions to that as well. There's cases where they're interstate and they're so egregious, someone has to tackle them. They always have legs, so they're always good cases. But essentially it means that we have to spend more time and more money to go and fight those cases, whether they're in the Northern Territory or WA or something like that. And in relation to those matters, usually what ends up happening is we get to the point where we're about to start the hearing, or we're a couple months out, and the hope has been that we're going to finally be able to travel interstate to run them ourselves, and the borders are simply closed, or the quarantine requirements are 2 or 3 weeks in quarantine. So the only option at that point is to find the alternatives and to work it out, basically, either postponing the matter or having an agent appear for us, or appearing via AVL or something like that. It's a very, very difficult process right now doing interstate matters. But in terms of the quality, the matters that we're running, I wouldn't ever advise a client to plead not guilty to a charge if I don't think that it has the potential to work in their favor, because a not guilty plea and then a guilty finding will actually work against you worst. So what I always tell people is, if this is a successful case, I'll let them know at the front of the matter. And if they tell me to plead not guilty, essentially, after that conversation, normally they won't, but we take the instructions on board. But there's never a case that we run that we don't think that we can win or that isn't set up to win. There's nothing nefarious like that. In terms of the funding of the matters, I can't speak to any of that. At the end of the day, I know that the matters are crowdfunded, but ultimately I'm a contracted lawyer essentially. So they bring me the matter. I tell them what the estimate is, trying to keep our costs level with what we're charging. We're trying not to really make too much money out of these matters, if any money. I mean, some matters, they take hundreds of hours and go for a whole year and you don't make any money out of them. And the reality of the situation is most COVID cases are like that. So what we do is we take those matters on, we tell RV how much it'll cost, and essentially they send us the money to cover our costs in the matter, fight for the person, try and get them the best possible outcome. In relation to Supreme Court matters, I've got a Supreme Court matter right now that we're running, and we've got barristers, we've got the whole shebang set up. The reality is we're working very hard. We think that there's very, very good prospects and that the case is, highly arguable. But ultimately, the law is not like a mathematical equation. There is no right versus wrong answer necessarily. Sometimes you're off in the grey and you just have to make your best case and see where the court ends up. And in relation to some of those bigger cases that Rebels funded, that's what I think is the more common sense answer. There's a lot of lawyers out there, they will poke holes and they'll say, well, this matter didn't have any legs, or this matter didn't have any chance of success, or this argument was terrible. But ultimately, if you're looking at it from a sort of more set back position, you can see that, different people have different legal opinions. There's usually not some conspiracy to, knock something out in the government's favor or something, like that. The reality is, common sense would say this is just different professionals with different opinions giving different diagnoses of the case. There is no right versus wrong answer 100% in the law. So, anyone who's ascribing, bad motives to some of these lawyers that are out there fighting whatever case, I would say to take a step back. There's good arguments that you can make. There's bad arguments you can make. There isn't anything as a right and wrong necessarily. But at the end of the day, these people have stepped up to the plate to do something which no one else was willing to do. And you should at least be supportive of that.
Yeah. No, this wasn't an attack for anyone wanting to view this as me doing something negative towards someone else. It wasn't. It was merely a genuine question. But Arby works extremely hard, and I know a lot of people don't. Yeah, it works really hard. Like, if a lot of people may like him, may not like him, whether you like him or not, he works hard to the point where he runs himself, I think, exhausted. And so that's in and of itself worth complimenting. But yeah, I just thought I'd put it out there, ask the question, you've responded, all good, moving on. But yeah, no, that's really good. And I have respect for any alternative media that is attempting to right the wrongs of society. What do you think about the concept? People keep saying this. Ricardo Bossi is the main person who's saying this, Nuremberg 2.0. Do you think that's a reality? Do you think we'll see that in our lifetime? Or do you think that's a little bit too fictitious and hopeful and optimistic?
The way that I would put this is you have to look at it from the perspective of what Nuremberg 1.0 was. Nuremberg 1.0 was post-war. We beat the Germans, we beat the Japanese. They literally had unconditionally surrendered and we could do whatever we wanted with them. What we decided to do was not to line them up and just shoot them arbitrarily. We decided to put them on trial for crimes against humanity. So if you're talking about Nuremberg 2.0, what you would be saying is, if you're invoking the spirit of Nuremberg, the original trials, you're saying that there have been crimes against humanity, and undoubtedly in some places there has been. To some degrees, there's certainly been violations of human rights in Australia, and there's no denying that.
ScoMo should be a part of it. Gladys, definitely Dan Andrews, McGowan. There's so many premiers that need to be in this 2.0. So I keep going.
Sure, yeah, no, and that's the thing. If you're gonna do it, there's a whole bunch of political actors, not only in the top leadership, but in the bureaucracy. There's police officers. There's a lot of people that are complicit in this. And if you're going to line them up and say, well, we're going to have a trial of you for what you did now, you would be looking at a situation where you've got literally hundreds and hundreds of people that you've got to be able to say, okay, well, these people are now being tried. To do that, similar to Nuremberg 1.0, you'd have to have the kind of political power in that environment in Australia to turn around and say, all these people are now completely powerless and we're going to put them to trial. I don't believe that there's ever going to be a time in the future where the Australian public has voted its way to actually be able to have what people are calling for a Nuremberg 2.0. There's no way you'd be able to get an entire parliament elected to agree to do something as drastic as that to former leaders or former bureaucrats or police officers or whatever it is. So the only way you'd have something like that is essentially some dramatic event happening in the country, and the side that is pro-freedom or pro-vindication gets on top and then puts all these people to trial, okay?
What if there was a coup?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think...
That, like all, Argentina is a country below Colombia. I'm half Colombian. And they used to have coups every other week. Evita and her husband, you know, that musical "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina." Her husband was the predecessor of a coup. So he was elected.
I think it's possible. I mean, anything's
I'm not saying
possible.
I want a coup, although I wouldn't mind one if there was no bloodshed. Yeah, go.
It's a Murphy's Law situation. Anything can happen. But
because you're saying Parliament, it'll never happen with Parliament. So here's an alternative.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing. There's lots of alternatives. The older alternative is there's a revolution, but the reality is, first of all, as much as it's a possibility, these sorts of dramatic events are never good for the country on a whole. It's better for a slow transition or a political transition within the framework that we already have set up to happen. I'm in favor of a revolution of the mind. That's what I'm in favor of. I'm in favor of the Australian public changing its thinking and acting differently and voting differently after this experience, and that the change be essentially incrementally. Well, it is, but at the same time, that's happened much more than...
You're so cute.
You know, that's happened a lot more, dear, than bloodless revolution.
I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm just joking.
No. But I'm saying I'm Iranian. My background is Iranian. So if you
revolution!
can imagine, that's the thing. They had one, and it didn't work. It didn't work.
No, it didn't, because you guys, the Iranians chose Ayatollah something.
Well, no, the Shah. There was never really a choosing. The whole thing was hijacked,
what do you mean?
And that's the point.
But the Shah got ousted.
Yeah, but the revolution that was a democratic revolution at first, which is what all the young people were in favor of, was hijacked by clerical thugs and hijacked by people that were politically opportunistic. It's hijacked by communists as well.
Oh, wow.
And the communists ended up copying the raw end of the deal afterwards. But at the end of the day, there's a whole lot of players in this. And what I would say is that people who are in favor of revolution, of armed conflict, of coup d'etats or any of that sort of stuff have to realize that dramatic consequences are not necessarily always going to be in their favor, almost never in their favor. There's only one revolution. There's only one revolution in history. You know, I've studied a lot. You can see all the books behind me. There's only one revolution in history that actually paid to the people that it was meant to be working for. That's the American Revolution. And it's the only revolution that still stands today. It's the only revolutionary country that still manages to be a successful, coherent, cohesive society. And as much as they have problems now, you're talking about America in the context of over 200 years of development since that time. So they didn't fall apart like, for example, the French or the Iranians or any of the South American countries where they had those coups or they had those revolutions and then everything fell apart overnight. The reality is the Americans with their revolution had a good bedrock of principle. And if I can cite one of the main founding fathers of America, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, when he was asked about the American Revolution, do you know what he said about the American Revolution, Dale? He said the American Revolution is not the period where the American colonists were at war with the British. The American Revolution was the 15 years preceding 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, where Americans started to evolve in their thinking. It was a revolution of the mind, because that revolution in the mind was what made possible the Declaration of Independence. It's what made possible the ability of all these people to turn around and call themselves patriots and say, we will not take it anymore. Now, the only reason you had a bloody revolution there is because the British made peaceful revolution impossible. And in Australia, there's no doubt in my mind, because you brought it up, history dictates that those sorts of things inevitably always happen. It can't be avoided. Economic catastrophe, natural disaster, war, revolution, it happens in every modern country. It's always happened. It will happen. The question is the Australian government going to drive people into a corner to feel like they need something drastic like that done? My answer over the past 20-something months has been, why are you guys trying to put people in a position where they're even contemplating such drastic action? If you have a health issue, health issues can be dealt with in a manner that doesn't require this level of control and force. So why is the government putting people in the position where someone like Ricardo Bossi is coming out and saying that sort of drastic change is needed? The fact that they've put us in a position as a population where that's what people are talking about right now, that we're having this conversation, shows that there has been a fundamental failure. The first answer that the people should give is they should put their hands up, particularly at the next election, and say, we've had enough. We want something to change. We're going to vote to change it. And that should be the first point of call. Revolution, coup d'etat, all of that stuff, it's the last resort, as all the way at the back of the list of choices. And it should be done only if people have a cohesive understanding and set of principles that guide them. But with that said, I'm not in favor of it.
But you think the Australian people can have a cohesive understanding? I don't mean to be disrespectful or rude or condescending, but I've been at this for 5 years. I've been doing political commentary and all that kind of stuff for about 5 years. And Australians don't seem any wiser now than before. The only thing that their line is so drastic. Like, I'll get a third booster, I'll get a fourth booster, I'll get a fifth booster. That's still okay to some people. They understand because, a variant, and because, the flu needle changes every year and blah, blah, blah. Some people, their line is children. That they don't want their children jabbed for whatever reason, yet it's okay for them to get jabbed. If I don't know how to reconcile either of those. If you're okay to get jabbed, then your kids should be fine to get jabbed too. Can I say I wouldn't allow it at all. Go ahead.
That's a good point. But can I say, at the end of the American Revolution, there's a lot of things that people don't understand about this. At the end of the American Revolution, 20% of the population of the continental United States was still considered loyalists. They had to, all those people had to leave. They went and they moved to Canada, which is why you can see, Justin Trudeau and the mob there. The culture there is very much like here. We will kiss the boot. But with that said, the same culture existed in the pre-revolutionary United States. The same culture was there. It was king and country. They were doing toasts to the king. That was what the United States culture was. At the beginning of the revolution, there was probably a minority, a very, very harsh minority, who were in favor of revolution. Probably something like 40% were in favor of revolution, with a large number sitting on the fence. The reality is, if you talk about 1760, but well before the American Revolution, 15 years, 16 years, the reality is no one would have been in favor of revolution. They were all king and country people. Sure. Then the ratchet started getting turned, and you started to get more and more people turning around and saying, we need something different. We need more freedom. We need independence. If you consider how long it took the Americans to build up to that point where they were prepared for a revolution of thinking, not necessarily a armed struggle. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a revolution in their thinking. It took more than 15 years for the American people to turn around and have 50%-ish in favor of independence, freedom, liberty, all of those core values that we talk about and that we value right now.
Okay.
The reality is we are in year 2 of this, authoritarian period. It's still early days. Now, the reality is, and I would say, because I know what you said is true. Generally, people are pretty apathetic. But I wrote an article back in, I think it was April of 2020. And I said right during the first lockdown, I said, this is the road to hell being paved with good intentions.
I said that in the first 3 months. I was saying it in my head and to friends. Yeah.
And if you remember, no one believed us. No one listened back then.
We were crackpots.
That's it. You couldn't organise a protest of 15 people outside of New South Wales Parliament I was at one 2 weeks ago where there were 20,000 plus people in attendance. The number of people from last year this time to this year who are completely changed in their thinking has, it's skyrocketed. The percentage, the percentage of people that are now waking up to the idea that, first of all, this has been blown out of proportion. Second of all, the government has been blowing it out of proportion. And third, that they need to start doing something different and thinking differently. The number of people who have fallen into that category of change has grown dramatically. And as time goes on, when you're being told you can't go to your local pub without a booster shot, or you can't go to work without a booster shot, there's going to be a lot of people who went and got 2 jabs thinking that this was the solution, who are going to turn around and say, you know what, I've hit my threshold. I'm not happy about this. I don't want to do this anymore. Yeah. And those people will add to the ranks, and there's going to be more and more people into it who are going to turn around and say, no, we're not happy. Within a couple of years, you'll start to see 50%, 60% of the population are turning around and saying, we think this is all hooey. And at that point, the government has to make a decision. Is it going to continue to do the same thing, or is it going to turn around and is it going to give people what they're asking for, which is relaxed, for example, times? Now, if it goes down the road of not relaxing, you'll see revolutionary situations occur. And that happened all over the world. If the government does what I think it'll do, which is, conform to public opinion and public pressure. If a majority is on side, career politicians want to stay in power, they'll change their message. If that's what happens, which is what I suspect will happen, you'll see a rollback or a decline in the number of regulations in this regard. But at the end of the day, it's going to take time for the Australian public to change their thinking. It's going to take time for people to go. One quick example is the Liberal Democrats. 3 years ago, I should say, Liberal Democrats had, a very small status compared to now. The number of people who went and joined the Liberal Democrats, because they are the party that's been vocally anti-COVID lockdowns and anti-mandate. That's right. Because they were the first ones to come out and say, no, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. And UAP's a party which was dead. UAP was being prepared to deregister. UAP was dead. And now UAP is one of the most powerful political forces in the country, building up its resources, waiting for an election. That's happened because the people have started to wake up, and people are changing their perception of things. And they're gonna change things in a peaceful manner. They're gonna elect people to parliament. And that's the way that things are going to change. I always say this, and this doesn't help me to say this. The reality is you can't litigate your way out of this. I can challenge the constitutionality of, for example, restrictions on protesting, and we can get that resolved, right? But ultimately, I can't destroy the entire public health apparatus. It won't work. Anyone who's aiming to do that will fail. No judge in the land will be overzealous enough to do that. So we can attack it from the flanks, but we can't take it head on. The only way we can take it head on is if people vote differently and elect different people to parliament. We can get these things overturned politically. In their entirety, you can get them overturned. Legally, we can only attack them from the wings, and we can only attack them on their weakest points.
What about hang on. Responding to someone. What about the commentary that many make, particularly like Aussies, like Aussie men who are like in veterans? They say this, and I think they're right. Well, what are your thoughts on this? That societies in the past, like the Roman Empire, Egyptian empires, they were the most successful civilizations for their time, but they had to hasten their destruction to then emerge again. Hasn't the Western world we've been at it for a while? Shouldn't we dismantle and then rise up again? Isn't it better for us basically to hit bottom? Isn't that a good thing? Because it then means we can rebuild and start, putting our civilization back on a biblical foundation, rather than have men marry their cows. Like, I mean, bestiality will be legal soon. Like, I don't know. Shouldn't we fail and fall and then rise up? What are your thoughts?
Well, if I can say, actually, the New South Wales government just became, I think, the second government in Australia to make the possession, or at least it's passed in the lower house, make the possession and distribution of animal abuse videos and materials actually illegal. I'm not sure when it's going up to the upper house, but there's an amendment. Yeah. So anyone who has possession of bestiality videos or something like that will end up being persecuted. Obviously, bestiality is already illegal. But the reality is,
you're allowed to watch it.
Until recently, yes, they've changed it now. I think the Animal Justice Party brought an amendment to the Crimes Act for that purpose. Anyone who's interested in this should look it up. It is interesting the way that the laws are structured right now. But putting that to the side for the moment, the position that you stated, what I would say is I'd tweak it a little bit. In relation to civilizational collapse and rebirth, that has happened numerous times. So you had, the Western world was the Roman and the Greek civilizations, had a large, growth during the classical period and the early medieval period, and then essentially during those periods collapsed and then went through the Dark Ages. Renaissance hits, we get back up. That's something that's happened. Eastern world, you had, for example, the great classical civilizations, Sumeria, Assyria, Persia. They rose up and then collapsed, dark aged as well, came back up during the Islamic Golden Age with all their scientific literature, which was well timed to match the medieval period for Europe. So all the materials that Europe basically no longer cared for or couldn't read were taken in and were kept in libraries, were reinterpreted, were rewritten, translated by the Islamic scholars. And then once the Islamic world in the 12th century fell, it timed perfectly. Europe picked up all of those tortures and we had the renaissance of the Western world. And it's been basically off that period that we had the second resurgence of Western history, if you can call it that. Now, what I'd say is if you're talking about civilizational collapse, there's never been a society that's really gone into the toilet on purpose. It's something that just happens over the course of time through.
Well, shouldn't it happen here?
Well, it's not a question of should, it's a question of is. And it's a question of is because as time goes by, what made the civilization successful is eventually whittled away and broken down to the point where civilization isn't the same civilization, it's something else which isn't successful necessarily. And when that happens, the civilization will collapse. Another civilization which doesn't have those same flaws will come up. And then inevitably the one that, let's say we're talking about Australian civilization or something like that, if it collapses or if Western civilization collapses, the rebound would take hundreds of years potentially to occur. No one causes civilizational collapse on purpose just so that they can get the bounce back, because you're not guaranteed that. The civilizational bounce back could be hundreds of years. Islamic world hasn't bounced back in over 500 years. So the question ends up being...
it was bouncing back.
There's a lot of things that were, a lot of things were bouncing back. But at the same time, if I can say this, the Iranian situation is very particular. And it's the same issue we see in Turkey and other countries right now. Civilizational collapse is not just, and rebirth isn't just one generation. It's large numbers of generations that make civilization. The Shah in Iran was another example, and he's been replaced with the exact same problem. You have a culture of strongmen in the Middle East. And this is something which, if you talk to an Egyptian, they'll say the same thing to you. There's a culture, for some reason, in the Middle East, of a preference in the everyday person's mind for some kind of strongman, someone that they can look to, that they can rely on, that will dictate to them in the manner that they see fit. That was the Shah for a period of time. When that was no longer working, there was a revolution. Now we have a different group of strongmen who are coming through and have basically butchered the country. They're going to be inevitably deposed because the circumstances dictate it. When they are deposed, the question is, will the Iranian people then ask for another strongman, a Democrat strongman to come in? Or
bring back the Shah's family.
Or the Shah's family. And there's no guarantee that they're going to be ideal either.
They had kids.
Yeah. There's no... Yeah, the prince in waiting, he has two daughters. I think it's 2 or 3 daughters. The question is...
women. It's out.
Well, no, it's still possible. I think the Iranian people are quite modern. So,
okay, good. I hope so.
If I can say this, the question is, those cultures, those regions, they can bounce back and they will bounce back.
I hope so.
Civilizationally. But it takes generation after generation, slow, steady change of progress and thought cultural change over the course of time makes civilizations. So in terms of Australia and in terms of the Western world, we are definitely changing fundamentally what we stood for and what made us great. We have changed the fundamental values, economic values, social values, political values that made us great. A lot of the things that we were against in the 20th century are now being made everyday public order in Western countries in the 21st century. And we can see that now with the pandemic, with the laws that are coming out. So, we are moving towards a degradation of these values. Is it going to cause civilizational collapse overnight? I don't think so. I don't think within this century. I think it'll take at least another 100 years for you to say that our civilization has taken a back seat to another civilization. And I don't think that the collapse happens overnight. The collapse happens over the course of 1 or 2 centuries. And you can see that with the Romans, for example. It took time. But with that said, it doesn't have to lead to absolute collapse. There are periods within a collapse, 200 or 300 years, where people can actually extend the trajectory so that they don't collapse when they would have otherwise collapsed. If you have 1 or 2 generations actually come in and reinvigorate what is meant to be, they can actually prolong the life of the civilization. They can prolong the life of their country and everything that it stands for by reinvigorating the spirit of whatever they previously stood for. That is the conservative movement, basically, in a nutshell, is going and reinvigorating that. Now, in Australia, you haven't really had a conservative movement for at least the last 40 years, I would say. Now there are genuine conservatives. Yeah. Now there's genuine conservatives coming out saying, no, I don't want any of this, pseudo-communist crap. We are not going to support any of that. We want to go to proper conservative values, what the country did stand for and no longer does stand for. That's what we want back. Those people are the people who, if they have the numbers, will be able to prolong, not prevent, but prolong the collapse. But with that said, that's something that happens hundreds of years later. So I wouldn't be too worried. Anyone who's saying, we should be pushing the society for a collapse or something like that, those people, I think,
they don't say pushing for it, but they reckon that will happen. And they reckon it'll happen in our lifetime. Yeah. They reckon it'll happen in the next 5-6 years.
I don't think so.
Whereas you're saying it'll happen in 200 to 300 years.
Yeah, I think that's what will happen. I think the reality is that the society is being degraded. The civilization is being degraded, but I don't think it's on the verge of collapse. It may not be the only superpower anymore. So, for example, I like to give this example. The Romans were the superpower at one point, and they were the sole superpower. And then they ended up butting horns with a former superpower that made the resurgence, which was the actual Persian Empire. Sasanians came up, Parthians came up, and they actually contested the dominance of Rome within the Mediterranean. So Romans were no longer the only superpower after a certain point. And that's exactly the way the world works. There's a very limited period of time where there's one superpower. Right now, we've had one superpower for at least, I would say, the last 100 years. I think the Soviet Union was a shell, essentially. The reality is you have an Eastern superpower rising. It's going to be China. The question is how these two powers are going to interplay. Are they going to fight economically, or are they going to fight with ballistic missiles? My preference is that we're going to compete economically, because economically, that's what our game is. Economics is Western developed. It's, capitalism. That's the whole point. So if we can compete that way, let's do it.
Yes, but it's not going to happen, dude. Like, why they got rid of Ford? It's now manufactured in another country. How are we going to bring it back when our government is doing everything in its power to remove? Like, how many people have lost their businesses? We're not going to make it economically. I want to. I actually agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying that I don't know how likely that is. But I like that approach. I like that angle. I never thought of that. And so thank you for enlightening me.
That's it. Well, no, it's my pleasure. And what I would say is this. The only way it becomes realistic, and you're correct, it definitely isn't. If the leadership of the country ties both hands behind your back and tells you to go into a boxing match, you're going to get pounded. The question is, are we going to be able to make the right political changes in the next couple of years so that people can no longer have both hands tied behind their back? So the only way we get back to where we need to be to competing economically is if we have the right political changes and cultural changes in the country. That will take time. And as frustrating as it is for you, it's frustrating for me. It will take the better part of a decade to resolve those issues. It will take time for all of the bad ideas to filter through the process of discussion, forced discussion. People are going to have to discuss this in the next 2 elections, 3 elections directly. And that discussion, which will take place over at least the next 3 to 5 years, will influence the next decade and the decade after that. If we come out on top, we can take our hands out, we can put them up where they need to be, and we can defend ourselves. If we don't, we are heading for the kind of disaster that some people are talking about in a shorter period of time. Not so that it would cause civilizational collapse, I don't think, but enough so that it would not make our civilization recognizable. It wouldn't be the same anymore. It would be limping into the next century, basically.
Yeah.
And that's something we want to avoid.
Oh, of course, absolutely. Emma Pasquale wants to know if you think the minor parties will play the key role next year. I sure hope so.
I definitely think so, and I hope so. What I think is that we will pick up enough numbers in the Senate between UAP, LDP, and some of the other minor parties. We'll pick up enough numbers in the Senate to, at the very least, own the crossbench in the Senate. And that's obviously the best outcome. If we do that, we can basically control the supply of finances in the federal government. If we can control the federal government's finances by blocking supply if necessary, we can, by extension, control the state government's finances, because the state governments basically get all of their money from the federal government. So if minor parties are elected to the Senate, you will get minor parties blocking together, forcing the elected government to make concessions based on conservative or libertarian principles, preferably, in order to essentially push the country in the right direction. Now, my preference isn't just for the crossbench. My preference is that we get people elected to the lower house as well, because the more people that are elected in the lower house, as well as the upper house, essentially we get to put more pressure on government to actually make changes. My preference further down the track in the next 2 or 3 elections, in the next, for example, decade, is that these minor parties go to medium-sized parties or major parties, essentially where we would get a shifting of polarity, so that the Liberal Party is no longer the party people vote for if they are conservative-leaning. Rather, they will vote for the Liberal Democrats or UAP or whoever fills that void.
Let's make
the
that
Liberal
happen,
Party
please.
is finished.
Yeah.
And that happened in Canada. In Canada, the current ruling party only came along something like 30 years ago. So a minor party can become a major party. All that it requires is the right voices and the right leadership. And on top of that, the right, for example, cultural shift and the right intellectual shift within the public. In terms of leadership, you can see that we have the leadership. We have John Ruddick for the Liberal Democrats. We have Campbell Newman. We have David Limbrick. We have Ross Cameron. All these well-known figures. We have Tom Switzer from
Dean McRae.
IPA.
Yeah,
Dean is a legend. Dean is a legend, especially if you get a few beers into him.
Oh my gosh! Do you know?
So,
did you see the what I put up on Facebook?
Yeah.
Who's such a moron. All right, so keep going.
He's absolutely legendary. I absolutely love Dean. I wish he was living closer to Sydney, because if every LDP meeting was as interesting as that one, it would be amazing.
We'd have Australia back in 2 weeks.
Well, I think most of us would probably need Alcoholics Anonymous meetings afterwards, but that's a different question. But in terms of the first limb, we've got it. We've got the leadership. UAP has Craig Kelly, has Clive Palmer, has people like that, high-profile people stepping up. The question is, are people going to come through? Are people going to come to the party? And by the way that it's looking at the moment, it looks like they will. It looks like people will actually step up and vote for the minor parties. The last poll I saw, the last poll I saw said 40% of people are looking at the minor parties as basically their first preferences. That could be One Nation, that could be LDP, but they're looking at minor parties first, and that is something which is new in Australian politics.
No, that is new. It's really funny. I didn't intend on talking about this, but there's lots of footage of and photos of this, and it's Craig Kelly holding his hands like that. Lots of footage. I've seen it happen twice. It's not lots of footage. I just think it's a habit, and that he holds his hands like that. But people are saying that somehow he's, what is the word? Is that a Freemason symbol? I'm not sure.
Freemason. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, can you guys just vote vote for him or vote for any other minor party and then deal with the problem later. Like, it's not, I don't think it's a huge, he's saying all the right things. It could be that he is a Freemason. I highly doubt it, but it's just weird. Like, what do you think of things like that when people read into things like that?
I don't generally fall into the camp of someone who's looking at what people are doing with their hands while they're talking. It's not really big to me. But can I say that the anti-Masonic thing is not new? During the early part of the 19th century in America, there was actually a party called the Anti-Masonic Party, and it formed on the basis of the same conspiracy that Freemasons are running the entire universe, and that Freemasons are corrupting the country. Now, I never have bought into those sorts of things because I know how poor people are at actually managing things. I don't think that there's enough intelligence in any one group of people to be able to organize things.
Yeah,
I'm a firm believer that most people can't even decide intellectually and rationally what they're going to have for dinner. So I don't really think that people are, if you put them in a large group, even the most intelligent people are not capable of organizing society secretly. They can organize society.
There's a secret organization of like elites like Prince Charles and Bill Gates that come together and control. You don't think that?
I think they might get drunk and do nefarious things, but I don't think that they're controlling the world.
Really?
That's no.
What if I threw at you? No. Are you a Bible believing person or not particularly?
I'm religious, but I'm not Christian.
Oh, are you Muslim?
No, I'm a Zoroastrian. Culturally, I'm a Zoroastrian.
Oh, you're Zoroastrian. You're the first one I've ever met. That's that.
I'm not practicing. I'm just cultural. Culturally, I'm a Zoroastrian.
Well, whatever. You're still the first one I've ever met. Oh, interesting. That's actually something I've always wanted to know. I want to know more about that. That's not a topic I know anything about. But anyway, sorry. Outside, that's interesting. I forgot that there is Zoroastrianism in the Middle East, although they're a dying breed at the moment, sadly. But in regards to what we were just talking about, there are people say Freemasons, and then there's also the Illuminati, and then there's like other things that people talk about. But you're saying the people are crap at organizing and all that kind of stuff. What if I threw at you that the ones leading it are probably not human? Not to make myself sound like such a conspiracy case, but like I do believe that people are possessed by demons. That's a thing I believe that happens. So what if it was like something like that running it, or the devil?
Well, I can't really speak to that. If I can give you
the
sort of Zoroastrian,
I just turned this into a nut thing.
Sorry. Well, the way that the Zoroastrian ethic is it says that people have inherent to them both good and evil, and that people have to make a election between these two, whether their actions are going to be guided by good intentions and good outcomes, or whether they're going to be nefarious and evil in their conduct. People have to make that choice. Is basically it. There's nothing influencing you. You're responsible for your own conduct. That's what the ethic is in the modern time as well. So I'm, as much as I'm a cultural Zoroastrian, I'm very much a humanist in many ways. I would say that that's something which correlates between the two. I think that people are choosing not necessarily to be evil per se. I don't know that there's a whole bunch of people that are just being sadistic for their own sake of it. I think that there are people who are self-interested, and if that means they have to roast their mother alive, they're willing to do that. There are people like that, and those are the people who speak out of both sides of their mouth and who are perpetually lying and perpetually misinterpreting, perpetually backflipping. And you can see the picture I'm painting. You can think of the class of people that I'm talking about. Those people are the ones who should be kept away from high office, because those people will tell you something completely different tomorrow than they said yesterday. My view is that those people, if they're put in high office, they will screw people, and they have screwed people, whether they're in banking, whether they're in government jobs, whatever it is. Those people are trying to reap the most benefit for themselves. They're self-interested, and it causes evil consequences for the society. But I don't think that there are, people being evil because something outside them is influencing them. I think that it's a question of people being bad actors because they think that it's benefiting them being bad actors. And some of them don't even perceive it as being bad actors. Some of them see it as, I'm just looking out for my own chips. So that's the way that I'd posit it. And in my view, it's not hard to see throughout history that that's been the common trend, that that's how people act.
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, you don't have to get too much in the waters of spirituality or aliens or any of that sort of stuff. Just look at it from the perspective of people are corruptible in their nature. And if you put people that are more prone to being corrupt into high office or positions of importance, they're more likely to turn around and act in the manner that's most natural to them, which is to be complete dicks about, you know, how they're organizing things.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've touched on the full hour. In fact, we've gone over by 10 minutes, which is fine with me. But I really enjoyed having you on. I'll probably have you on for an official Wednesday night live because I don't normally go live on a Thursday. But I've really enjoyed having you, and it's good to have someone who has such a well, first of all, you're such an intellectual and has such a good background knowledge of history in general. Like, I think people think I love politics because maybe once upon a time I used to tell people I loved it. I don't so much now. I do prefer topics. I do prefer issue-based things, and I do love history. And even perceived history, the stuff like that I was talking about. Well, what about like this and what about like things that people speculate? I like that kind of stuff too. But I would love to have you back on for a panel show. I think it'd be really interesting to have you on with maybe like John Ruddick or something. I don't know.
That'd be cool. I'd always love talking with you and John. For me, John's awesome. So I'm sure we could talk a lot of cool stuff. And he's a history geek. The guy is just full of history.
That's my point. Yes, and I love history. Yeah, and I'm definitely a history buff. Not the same as you guys though. You guys like actually know. Like I love history because I have an interest in it and I just like to know about it and the stories, whereas you guys know it in sort of this in-depth way that I don't think I could match. But you know, I like Russian history and Egyptian history and I recently discovered that there were these people called Phoenicians, and I've been looking into that, and like, yeah, you probably already know about that, don't you?
Yeah, well, from ancient Syria, and then they went and colonized what became Carthage. And Carthage, obviously, Punic Wars. Yeah, they were in Spain. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say Malta in Spain too. Huh?
They were in parts. Yeah. They went and they colonized the eastern part of Spain, and that was the Carthaginians at that point. But they were all Phoenicians in their background.
Well, because of the Phoenicians, we have a knowledge on, I think, unless you can correct me, blacksmiths and stuff like that. What do you
Could well be the case. I'm not quite sure.
Metal bending.
Metallurgy or whatever they call it.
Yeah, whatever the word is. Yeah, but they're smart people. Anyway, I'll leave it there. You have, you know, a family a wife to please or whatever the hell, I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying. I'll stop.
I have a lot of work to do. As I said, we're preparing a Supreme Court case. And I want to say thank you to you for having me on. I love your platform, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm looking forward to the next one, especially if we can get John Ruddick on.
And ultimately, he's going to come on. He owes me. I've driven him home twice. So.
Good old John. And also, I'd like to say to anyone that's listening who has either contributed to the Fight the Fines campaign or just generally has been very vocal and active in the community, has been talking to their neighbors, has been standing up for what's right, has been voicing their opinion, whether it's, you know, against the lockdowns or for the lockdowns, but he's willing to have a conversation. Thank you. You know, we need more people in our society to stand up for what's right. And for those of you that have supported the Fight the Fines campaign and have therefore supported people like me who are actually trying to do the right thing by people that have been, you know, criminally accused, thank you so much for your support. I'm eternally grateful. Fighting for justice is the highlight of my career, and it's something I'm looking forward to in the future, going forward as well.
Amazing. Oh, that's so good, guys. Make sure you look into helping in any way you can. We need to look out for our community, and our community is anyone. And even if you don't get along and you feel like you have a mistrust of someone in it, if they're highlighting and amplifying someone else who has been hard done by, focus on that. You know, don't let, that's what I would say. Like, I could easily insult anyone I wanted, but, you know, I would rather compliment someone and say, you know, they do this and they do that. So that's how we should all be operating right now. God bless you all. Thank you so much for tuning into this unexpected live stream. And I'll have you back in future because I'm looking forward to this panel live that I just invented in my head.
Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Yay. Okay, I'm ending broadcast. Thanks, guys. See you